No, thanks so much to everyone organizing this festival for having us. And I don't know what it says about you that you're an expert in the weaponizing of anti-Semitism, but there's a lot of people sitting here who have actually experienced false claims of anti-Semitism. And for us, it will be interesting to also hear you after and have a conversation with you and discuss. So, Rahma and I have known each other for many years. No? Yes.
Like 2?
No, more than 2. And we have had these discussions before. So we wanted to come today and connect the politics of anti-Semitism to an increase in Islamophobia as well in the Netherlands. And so my part is to talk a bit, and I took some notes so that I'm tired at the end of the day, so that I don't forget anything. So apologies for reading. But what I wanted to talk is that the struggle over anti-Semitism discourse in the Netherlands, but also across the world, is a struggle over political control. Who gets to speak? Which forms of anti-colonial critique are permitted? How do state institutions draw the line between racism and dissent? In practice, many activists, researchers, and Palestinian solidarity organizers argue that anti-Semitism is not only a category of genuine harm rooted in Europe's long history of anti-Jewish violence, but also a flexible governing tool that can be activated to discipline, delegitimize, and outright silence Palestinian political expression and the racialized communities that organized around it. So the talk is not so much about anti-Semitism as a real threat, as one more form of racism, not different or special or supreme from others, but about the politics of it. And so at the center of this governance regime sits the infamous, you're back? Yes. Come back, yes. So at the center of this governance regime sits the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRA definition, working definition of anti-Semitism, which, if I'm not mistaken, was created in 2016 in Romania, I think. It's not a coincidence that this definition is created, constructed, and created turned into policy, not just constructed, but turned into policy at a time when the development of illegal settlements in the West Bank and across Palestine is increased in the development of illegal settlements, and also increasing attacks on Gaza as well in 2014 and 2016 and beyond. So there's no coincidence in the development of this definition and what is happening in Palestine. So it was formally presented as a non-legally binding interpretative, whatever that means, framework. It had nonetheless been widely adopted by governments, municipalities, universities, and civil society institutions across Europe. But for many, its political force lies precisely in its ambiguity. It operates less as a neutral, so-called neutral, not that exists, definition, and more as a semi-official boundary-setting device. The controversy is not about whether anti-Semitism exists, or about anti-Semitism at all, like I said earlier, but about how the IRA's illustrative examples fold criticism of Israel into the conceptual perimeter of anti-Semitism, creating a structural risk that anti-colonial speech is reclassified as racial hatred. In the Dutch context, organizations such as the Center for Information and Documentation Israel, the infamous CIDI, have been central actors in advocating for the adoption and institutional use of the IRA, and not just the CIDI, the CGA maybe also, but we will discuss that later. From a critical perspective, what emerges is not simply a debate over definitions, but an uneven field of power in which pro-Israel advocacy groups, state institutions, and segments of mainstream political discourse converge to determine which forms of Palestinian solidarity are deemed acceptable, if any, at all. Many argue that this convergence produces a chilling effect. Campaigns for boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS, anti-occupation organizing, occupation of Palestine, organizing, and even academic critique of Zionism are frequently placed under suspicion, investigated, violently treated, and publicly framed as bordering on anti-Semitism. This is where the concept of weaponization, without the inverted commas, because it is weaponization, becomes useful here. Not as a claim of a single coordinated actor, but a pattern of institutional effects. Anti-Semitism accusations can function as a regulatory mechanism. They reroute political critique away from questions of colonialism, apartheid, and occupation, and back into a moralized discourse where the critic must defend their legitimacy rather than the subject of critique being examined. In this sense, the accusation itself becomes a form of political containment. Alternatives to this terrible definition, the definition, by the way, has 10 statements, 7 of which are about Israel only. So there's not only Jews in Israel, obviously. And so alternatives to such definitions are the Jerusalem, for example, the Jerusalem Declaration of Antisemitism, the GDA, that the Gemeente Den Haag adopted, when was it, 2 years ago? Thanks to a collective of anti-racist coalition from Leiden University, including student associations, Leiden Scholars for Palestine, and at the time I was part of that collective, and others who reached out to the Gemeente in Den Haag, to Hera Bad from GroenLinks, and said, our protests, our actions have been repressed, and we're experiencing police violence. Who's calling the police, the mayor or the university? We need your help. She was a very friendly, aligned person, already part of the anti-colonial struggle, so we had meetings, and then they adopted this Jerusalem definition of Declaration on Antisemitism, which emerged in response to these tensions that the IRA has, right? The JDA attempts to reassert clear boundaries between antisemitism and criticism of Israel, explicitly protecting political speech regarding Zionism, Palestinian rights, and state violence. But, big but, yet even here, the framework remains structurally limited. There's a really good, by the way, article. What is it? Let me find it. I have it here. In Al Jazeera by Muhannad Ashad, professor of sociology at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Canada, that you can read with more details about the JDA and the problematic and why it is problematic. Yet even here, the framework remains structurally limited. It operates within European epistemic horizons, which are extremely Orientalist, and treats anti-Semitism as the primary or organizing axis of racial analysis in the debate about Palestine and Israel, while Palestinian experiences of settler colonialism, displacement, and ongoing military occupation are treated as secondary or external, emotional concerns rather than constitutive political realities. But this is not just a theoretical or semantic struggle. In the Netherlands, these definitions conflicts have repeatedly surfaced in concrete disputes over public spaces such as university spaces, public events, and active organizing. Palestine solidarity initiatives have faced cancellations, institutional distancing, police brutality, and political pressure in contexts where anti-Semitism concerns were raised in response to protest lectures or cultural interventions critical of Israeli occupation and genocide. The infamous report of the ridiculous Task Force Against Semitism at Universities represent this profound distortion of the struggle against racism and discrimination at universities and in the movement at large. So this task force and the report, rather than confronting anti-Semitism as one more form of oppression or discrimination among many, it instrumentalizes Jewish safety to advance a political agenda aimed at suppressing opposition to Israel and silencing solidarity with Palestine. By deliberately, conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, the report seeks to place criticism of occupation, apartheid, settled colonialism, and the ongoing devastation of Gaza, which continues with the blockage of aid and sanitary services and healthcare, beyond the boundaries of legitimate political debate. So it places that beyond the boundaries of legitimate political debate. In doing so, it transforms the fight against anti-Semitism from a necessary struggle against hatred into a weapon of censorship directed at students, staff, and activists who challenge state violence. This collapsing of categories is not incidental. It suits the increased securitization and militarization of universities in the Netherlands. The report's greatest contradiction is that it claims to speak on behalf of Jews while erasing Jewish dissent. Anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, including Erev, the collective that I'm part of, have publicly rejected its premises, warning that the task force appropriates Jewish identity and historical trauma in service of a project of political repression. Our opposition exposes the report's central fiction, that support for Israel and Zionism is synonymous with Jewishness itself. This erasure of anti-Zionist voices, Jewish voices, and anti-Zionist voices in general, is not an accident, but a necessity for a framework that depends on collapsing political ideology into an ethnic and religious identity. At the same time, the report remains strikingly silent about the actual threats surrounding campus protests and sit-ins. It has little to say about the police violence against demonstrators, intimidation and attacks by far-right Zionist groups, anti-Muslim racism, the surveillance of activists, or the broader authoritarian drift that has swept through universities and public institutions. Palestinian students and their allies are rendered visible only as a problem to be managed. The result is a hierarchy of racism in which some experiences of discrimination are elevated, while others are ignored, denied, or actively reproduced. Far from defending universities as spaces of critical inquiry, the report encourages their transformation into sites of ideological policing, where support for Palestinian liberation is treated as inherently suspect, and political dissent is reframed as security threat. People coming in? Yeah.
That's my husband.
So this does not challenge power, it protects it. It does not expand the struggle against racism, it narrows it and weaponizes it. At a moment when governments and institutions are increasingly criminalizing protest and suppressing solidarity movements, the report stands as part of a broader effort to discipline public debate, insulate Israel and Europe from accountability, and turn the language of anti-racism into a mechanism for enforcing political conformity. I feel like I'm missing out on something. Here, anti-Semitism allegations are not simply reactive responses to discrimination, but preemptive frames that reclassified anti-colonial critique as potential hate speech, thereby narrowing the space for racialized communities, particularly Muslim and Arab and Palestinian diaspora groups, to organize publicly without surveillance or reputational risk or all forms of risk. And Abu Rashed, for example, comes to mind. By the way, he's been acquitted of all accusations, as you all know. What makes this dynamic politically significant is not only the invocation of anti-Semitism, but the asymmetry it produces. Jewish safety is rhetorically centered, while Palestinian dispossession is structurally marginalized. The result is a field in which certain forms of anti-racism are elevated as institutional priorities, while others are rendered precarious or suspect. And this does not simply reflect inconsistency, it reflects a broader European governance pattern in which historical memory, security frameworks, and identity politics are mobilized to manage and repress dissent in ways that often reproduce colonial hierarchies under the language of anti-discrimination. And so the politics of anti-Semitism have increasingly been folded into a wider far-right restructuring of race, belonging, and state power, one in which anti-Muslim and anti-Arab racism are not incidental but foundational. And this is something that connects to the Islamophobia as a foundational part of these forms of governance and Zionism in general. Parties such as Wilders' party, what was Wilders' party? Yeah, that one. Parties such as the PVV or Wilders have spent years and years normalizing a political common sense in which Islam is constructed as a civilizational threat. Muslim presence is framed as a problem of security and integration, and exclusion is repacked as cultural preservation. Within the same parliamentary ecosystem, figures like, another nut job, Baudet, have held mainstream ethno-nationalist imaginaries of decline, conspiracy, and cultural replacement, widening the space in which racialized communities are treated as inherently suspect political subjects rather than equal participants in public life. Alongside them, the biggest nut job at the moment, Gidi Markusover, represents a stand of hardline securitarian politics in which migration, asylum, and Palestinian solidarity are repeatedly collapsed into narratives of threat, criminalization, and incompatibility with Dutch society. With this configuration, the weaponization of anti-Semitism does not sit apart from far-right politics. It is absorbed into it. A selective rhetoric of defending Jews and supporting Israel is frequently mobilized by segments of the same political spectrum that simultaneously advances Islamophobic policy agendas and legitimizes cultural exclusion. This produces a deeply unstable but politically and economically productive arrangement. Anti-Semitism is invoked as a moral boundary marker of European civilization, while anti-Muslim racism is intensified through narratives of security, terror, and demographic threat. Palestinian solidarity, especially when organized by those racialized, or by migrants, or Muslim communities, becomes the site where these logics converge. It is here that anti-Semitism accusations can be strategically activated to discipline anti-colonial speech, delegitimize organizing, and recode political dissent as extremism. The result is a racialized hierarchy of legitimacy. Far-right Islamophobia is often absorbed into normal politics, while anti-colonial critique is rendered perpetually conditional, suspect, and vulnerable to institutional sanction. And in my opinion, and to end here, finally, the core issue here is not whether anti-Semitism definitions are needed, which is a fair question, especially when no other form of racism has any institutionalized definitions, but to reflect and think how are these definitions, when are these definitions constructed, how are they constructed and operationalized, by whom, against whom, and to what political end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for a great kickoff. We have some extra chairs, but there's also probably extra people coming in. But if you want to chair, there are more here in the front.
There's a dying fly somewhere.
Quick technical point, could you open the door a little bit, please?
Yeah, it's very,
Is it warm? Yeah.
it's very hot, yeah.
I thought it was me getting passionate about but now that you say it, yeah.
Point. Now we have Rahma. By the way, this meeting lasts until 8:45, so a bit longer than the other meetings. And Rahma will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes as well, and then we have an audience discussion. So, Rahma.
Okay, thank you so much, Lorraine and International Socialists, for inviting me. It's great to share the platform with my dear friend Elena and to see familiar faces. My talk will be a little bit more empirical and kind of really concretely mapping out the various praxis of the Zionist lobby in the Netherlands, which connects to the documentation that I've been working on for the NGO in the past 2.5 years, looking at the intersection of Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. But of course, the organizations and the individuals and the politicians promoting these ideas are mostly the part of the Zionist lobby, or have a long embedded history of racism and Islamophobia in their politics and have kind of latched on to the Zionist narrative. So there is an exchange or like a connection between the two that is reinforcing. This is here because this will be the front page of the report that we're publishing soon. And we're using the artwork of a Palestinian artist who's still in Gaza actually, and she here used, of course, Van Gogh's famous painting, so we thought it was suitable. Here is one of the pages in the 2021 report of the ELSC, the European Legal Support Center, one of the main organizations that challenges anti-Palestinian repression legally through taking on cases and also sharing knowledge and research. And I found this very helpful. It's kind of grouping the primary actors in the Zionist lobby in the Netherlands, which are organizations whose primary goal is to promote the interests of Israel in the Netherlands. And I'm actually not familiar with
the CDs there.
The left, yeah. The CD is probably the noisiest one or the most well-known, and includes both Jews and non-Jews. NGO Monitor is directly funded by Israel, and it's very well known that this is the case. With the CD, it is more a little bit less clear where their funding comes from. They're not transparent about it, but they fit into the general picture of Israel in the recent 10 years, especially using civil society organizations, kind of almost co-creating civil society organizations top down in various European countries to represent their interests. And Christenen for Israel, of course, is a Christian Zionist evangelical mostly organization, but also includes Christian Zionists. Of course, also include centrist Christian parties that are not seen as radical or orthodox from within the Christian community, but are almost equally Zionist as the more radical evangelicals. And then you have the facilitating actors, which are a number of right-wing platforms. The Telegraaf is actually the most read newspaper in the Netherlands, and it's almost like a direct mouthpiece for the Zionist lobby, which you could see, Elena mentioned the Abu Rashid case, which was recently, he was acquitted of supporting terror with his... It's a very, very important case because we've seen very different results in our neighboring countries. And the Telegraaf was the first one to report on the acquittal. Literally, like we were going after, trying to find, the first platforms covering the outcome of the case, and they were all right-wing platforms, and the Telegraaf clearly already had its narrative ready, and this is also part of the strategy that is used, right? Yes, he was acquitted, but there were mistakes in procedure, but he actually did have friends in Hamas, and but, etc. So this is part of how these close connections between actors in the Zionist lobby and these news platforms also immediately results with events in a framing that comes out of those organizations. And then we have the political parties, the far right, the Christian Zionists, and of course here only the most extreme ones are mentioned, but what we've seen of course in the past 2 years is that the entire political spectrum, including the parliamentary left, have failed to do anything really to stop the genocide. Now a little bit about my organization. So Meld Islamofobie was founded in 2015. And one maybe relevant thing to notice is that before the co-optation of anti-racist documentation and discourse by the state, it was mostly migrant organizations in the 70s and 80s that were involved in documenting and addressing and talking about racism. And they did so from a much more radical perspective than, of course, the government does. So there has been kind of a co-optation of speech about racism, of documenting racism, and with this co-optation, a depoliticization, but also the use of categories that Elena already talked about a little bit, that of course are based primarily in identity politics. So we're looking at anti-black racism separately, we're looking at antisemitism, we're looking at, and then of course the definition of antisemitism that is used in institutions, not by judges in the court, but in the institutions that document antisemitism. It is a combination, other than all the problematic factors that Elena mentioned. The definition itself combines ethnicity and religion. Whereas Islamophobia, of course, anti-Palestinian racism is not even a concept. It's not something people speak about within our institutions. But even Islamophobia is not acknowledged as a separate category, and racism against Muslims or people who are seen as Muslim, which is often all people of color, people who look Arab, this is always classed under, unless there's an explicit mention of their ethnicity, it is classed under discrimination on the basis of religion, which cannot and does not show the intersectional nature, of course, of racist experience in real life, but also its connection to colonial domination and political racism in general, which is, of course, the primary vector of racism in the Netherlands. So our organization is, in a way, a response to that depoliticization of anti-racist speech. It has its limitations because we focus on Islamophobia, but as Elena already mentioned, Islamophobia is not recognized, is in fact actively denied, while being encouraged by all the institutions that document racism, as well as our parliament and government. So in that sense, even trying to push for a definition and speaking about Islamophobia when we started in the midst of the war on terror in 2015 is highly political. and is necessary. But at the same time, in the past 2 years, we've been working on documenting the relationship between Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism, because Islamophobia, I would argue, especially in the Netherlands, is utterly central to manufacturing consent for genocide and for the repression of the Palestine movement. So an understanding of how Islamophobia functions in our institutions, in our administrative practices, is really fundamental also to how we fight the Zionist lobby and how we fight for the freedom to speak about Palestine in the Netherlands. So the report will come out soon. I will not talk a lot about the report today. I'm just taking out a few ideas. I also did a lot of literature research to write this, so I'm drawing on a number of books that have helped me a lot, and I want to acknowledge them here also for your own further reading. So here's one classic on the Holocaust industry by Norman Finkelstein. It's an older book on the way that the Holocaust has been exploited by the Israeli state to forge a national Israeli identity, but also by the lobby specifically in the US. The other two books are new. These are all by Jewish authors. Ilan Pape just published a book on lobbying for Zionism on both sides of the Atlantic, and then there's Harriet Malinowitz, who wrote Selling Israel, really using theories about propaganda, about Zionism propaganda and the uses of Hasbara. This is for your general knowledge about the lobby. There's one other really good book about the UK, which I used a lot more because it goes into Islamophobia more than these other books, and that is Friends of Israel by Hil Akkad, about the British lobby, and it is very helpful for the Netherlands, because even though the Zionist lobby there is larger than in the Netherlands, probably, and the anti-Zionist movement is larger as well, a lot of the mechanisms and strategies that we see there are also very common here in the Netherlands. So I just wanted to go through a few of those strategies very briefly, and then say something about what I think, having learned from this documentation practice, is important or might not be highlighted as much in what is needed to fight the lobby. So Hil Akkad very usefully talks about the Zionist lobby as a top-down movement. So he approaches it as a movement like bottom-up movements like the International Socialists, but what distinguishes the Zionist lobby from these these grassroots movements is that it's a top-down lobby. So its primary interest is the interest of a state, and also it tends to lobby power stakeholders more than ordinary people, so to say. But since the rise of the BDS movement in Europe and its success, they have started lashing out a lot more aggressively to the BDS movement, but have also started integrating more civil society initiatives into their lobby. So organizations that I was showing on the first slide, among them CD and NGO Monitor, they kind of look like they are civil society organizations with a membership, sometimes donators, people who donate to the organization. They engage the media, they might set up educational programs in schools, but they are not actually grassroots. They have been actively promoted and created by Israeli support and its actors and ambassadors. Embassies are also often involved in this in Europe. And so one important point about Hil Akkad's approach is that this is a network that can be mapped. It is not, he also tries to demystify the network by mapping it very meticulously. And this is where empiricism is important, and it also helps to challenge anti-Semitic ideas that do actually circulate, that, you know, there's some type of all-powerful Jewish lobby that is controlling Europe and the US from abroad, whereas the vast majority of Zionists in the Netherlands are not Jewish and have a long history of support for Israel for all kinds of reasons other than simply supporting Jews or being against anti-Semitism. So this is an important point. to keep in mind, and also to know how to challenge it, you need to map it empirically, right? Then very briefly, like historically, of course, portraying Palestinians as Nazis was there from the very, very early beginnings of the state of Israel, and of course as barbarians, as backwards, all these Orientalist stereotypes. But there's a very particular moment when kind of framing Palestinians as particularly Islamic or jihadist, when this kind of discourse started to emerge. And this started with Palestinians becoming the quintessential terrorists, right? And Israel played a big role in disseminating this image in the US and in Europe as well. And there are some particular moments that are kind of central to this. In the 1980s, this was still during the Cold War, and the emergence of the neoconservative movement in the US. And there were two large conferences, one of them in Israel and one of them in the US, where Benjamin Netanyahu, who then worked for the UK, was one of the participants, and other Israeli officials. And they, the proceeds of these conferences were actually published in a book. Netanyahu was the editor of this book. And in these conferences, a big effort was made to try to establish the Muslim terrorist as the biggest threat that that threatens Western civilization, of which Israel was, of course, positioned as a part. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Israel single-handedly, sparked the war on terror, but they did play a very fundamental role in rolling out also not only its ideology, but also some of its legal practices and the lawfare that we're seeing until today. Now, there's a lot more to this that I can't go into. One interesting point is that the anti-terror financing laws in the US, which have been very influential in Europe as well, they were literally custom made for the Israeli government to be able, and this is very well documented by rights organizations in the US, to pursue Palestinian charities. And many of them are Muslim charities or identify as Muslim charities. And these charities have now for years been a big target and have become so more and more in Europe as well. And in the Netherlands, the very first case against terror financing of charities was also against the Palestinian organization to which Abu Rashid was affiliated. Yes. So even in the Netherlands, anti-Palestinian repression is very central to how anti-terror policy works. How much time do I have?
You're talking for
minus 10.
15 minutes now.
Oh.
So how long?
But Tawfiq is not here.
Tawfiq is not here. Not long, right? But,
just saying.
How long do you think you?
I can do it in 5 minutes.
Okay,
I'll try to speak quickly.
Yeah,
I'll try to speak quickly. So there's a few I think pillars of the Zionist strategy in the Netherlands that are very important. There is the allies that they have, which were of course shown in the slide and that I talked about a little bit. So political parties, the Christian Zionist organizations, and Jewish Zionist organizations. There's also the law and lawfare. And of course, law usually comes first. And what we've seen is that, so maybe I should show you kind of the results of our research. So our research was mostly focused on, that's the wrong one. It's mostly focused on framings. And we examined a huge number of reports that were made to us by ordinary individuals who experienced interpersonal racism. And anti-Palestinian repression. And we examined in 2023-24 political discourse in the parliament throughout that entire period. And then we coded both of these sources for the way for racializing frames. And we examined only those reports or those statements that were both Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian. And then these were the main frames that emerged out of our coding work. And what we are seeing is that these frames usually do not occur on their own, either in political discourse or in what happens in the street. They are interconnected, they reinforce each other, and they are absolutely central to the way that anti-Palestinian repression is legitimated in the Netherlands, and also the kind of policy recommendations that are made as a result of that. So then about these policy recommendations, and this is where I think I want to emphasize what is maybe not being done enough, or not being noticed enough, not researched enough. We already have a huge apparatus of anti-terror and anti-radicalization policy that has been developed since 9/11, of which Muslims are the primary target. And that has very, very seriously eroded the civil rights of Muslims in this country, and of migrants, but who are also mostly framed as Muslim. And so the effect of these frames in the past few years has been that the Palestine movement as a whole, and dissent more generally, has been Islamized. And therefore it's become legitimate to apply the same policies to the movement as have been applied to Muslims for the past 20 years. And so some of the proposals that are already ongoing is the draft law to criminalize the glorification or sympathizing with terror. And we've just seen the case in the UK, direct action activists. This could very, very easily happen here as well, and it is coming. Secondly, wanting to intervene in the organization of protests without the intervention of a judge. So more authority for local governors to restrict protest. The ban on face coverings, right, that was introduced for Muslim women in 2019. No one cared about it. No one protested about it. Only a very, very tiny section of the left was actually interested. Because they're Muslim women, right? They target first the most abject figures, the IS terrorists who can lose their nationality when they travel to Syria, right? Those people that no one sympathizes with. Even many people in the Palestine movement, and even many people on the left do not. They do not think this is their problem. And this is exactly the mechanism we're seeing now, right? There are motions being passed that the Muslim Brotherhood should be banned, which has no factor of significance in the Netherlands at all. But many well-meaning leftists hear Muslim Brotherhood and they're like, oh, wow, that has nothing to do with us, right? This motion has been passed. We're going to see what has been happening in France, where Muslim organizations have lost their funding. There is surveillance and random arrests on a massive scale for people simply writing a tweet. And this has emerged out of very similar steps that we are going through now. So I guess my final message, and I'll end with that, is it is important to think big, right? And we've heard a lot of that in the rallies today, to think about how all struggles are connected, to think internationally, to think about what kind of world we want to see. But this struggle also happens on a very granular level, with standing up to particular practices. And this is where we really need to unite more. We need to focus more, because these administrative practices ultimately, even if they're very small, even if they're not even codified in law, like the protest rules that they want to introduce, right, giving a mayor more authority, these are creeping things that have already really eaten up, our society from within, and made a huge section of our society very vulnerable. And this is going to continue, and we need to work on this together. Thank you.